Okay, I guess, let's see, so it's 5:02. I'd like to call a meeting of the Police Oversight Policy and Procedure Review Subcommittee to order. And with our new guidelines for how we're going to operate, we'll move right to the approval of the agenda. Is there anything you'd like to add to the agenda? If not, we'll assume the agenda is approved as submitted. Minutes, are any comments about the minutes?
No.
All right, so I will, there's no amendment, I will sign the minutes as presented. Public comment, do you have any public comment? Looking around the room for members of the public, I see one.
Not today.
He's shaking his head, all right. So, getting right to item 5, the meat of the meeting is we decided we would have sort of an open, I think that at the last meeting we decided we would conduct the meeting in such a way that at the suggestion of Director Harness, we said we'd have, we could have more or less standing items with open-ended discussion. I think that's actually reflected in the minutes, and it's probably, so the item that I guess we'd like to have some discussion about is what is our strategy? What's our strategy going to be for this committee? What are we going to? How are we going to satisfy the ordinance and the CASA? And part B is where do we go from here? So I think it's a matter of where do we think we are to begin with, and what should what should be our strategy for going forward. So I'd like to open that up to discussion. I can say that we've had, one of the things we've done is we've exchanged some information, or at least I've sent out some information about policies that's been reviewed. I don't know if people have had a chance to look at that, but it seems that we can either look at that, we can look at, we can brainstorm ideas about what we think would be useful policies for review. So I'm open to suggestion there, but so the question is, does anybody have any place they'd like to start? You don't have it. Okay. So I'm looking at you now, and Member Vandeventer.
Yes. I think, well, I know that Jim raised a concern in an email that, that the previous configuration of this committee had already kind of adopted a rule that the committee was going to focus on CASA-related policies and do most of its work on those. And so what we've done in the past 2 meetings is deviate from that. He was really concerned because he wants, I think it's coming from a place of this, philosophy that we're trying to hold other people accountable to rules, and we're trying to make rules, so we need to follow our own rules. I think that we've discussed that though, and I think we understand that the things that are binding on us are the CASA and the ordinance and our official rules and procedures, but the subcommittee is free to do business as it likes. So I think we've largely kind of figured it out. As far as quantifying how much, the ordinance says it's the ordinance that says that we have to spend 50% of our time doing this. I don't know, I don't have suggestion. I personally hate time accounting, so to me that seems like maybe the only way to do it, or maybe we have a standing agreement that, if we meet twice a month, or, then we probably are likely working on policies and procedures for half of the time that the overall board is working on issues. I don't really know. But I think that what I was concerned about and why I asked for you to place this on the agenda was that I was getting the impression, and maybe I was misinformed or misunderstood you, that you as chair of this subcommittee want to focus on just what APD is doing. And if that's the case, I'm probably not really, I think that that's really important, and I want to do that also. But if we're thus limited, I'm not probably very interested in serving on this committee. So I think that we need to, I don't know what's left. I think we need to figure out whether or not we agree on what kind of stuff we want to work on.
Well, let me respond to your first proposal, and that is I don't think we're at all I don't want to be limited by what APD is doing. If I've left that impression, I'd like to dispense with that, because that's not at all how I feel. I just think that what has happened is we've sort of been preoccupied with that, given the change in administration of the APD and the new emphasis on trying to get connected to their policy process. But I think our a better use of our time is to make our own policy recommendations. And so, but to do that, I think we have to have a process for making those recommendations. And I think there's a number of things we can do, but I think we also need help. We need staff help in terms of doing that.
Well,
and I
we
think
certainly need our contract in place.
Yes, that's right. But I mean, given that, I think there's sort of a gamut. I mean, I think we need to think about what kind of role we fill within the city. I think one of the, looking at what the CPCs do, I think what they do, they tend to make things which come under what I'd call a category of suggestions. Here, why don't you change the color of the tint of the windows or the police cars or something like that? I think the POB policy role ought to be one of making the substantive changes to the to SOPs. And to do that, I think we either
I would say that's true, and then I would also add that I think we can also make other substantive policy changes that are not limited to SOPs, and I think we can also affect training. I think there's a variety of areas we can work within, and I think the simplest way to figure out what we want to do is to just talk about it, which is why I've suggested that we just have a brainstorming session about the types of things we're interested in, and that will guide what we do.
Okay, and I agree, but I think you're over limiting the subject by saying we can do things outside SOPs, because everything that APD does essentially is done with through an SOP. So training there's an SOP that deals with training. So if we want to have an impact on training, we still do it through an SOP. And if there isn't an SOP, then if we make a suggestion, for something that isn't covered by an SOP, then they'll write an SOP to cover it. I mean, that I think is just the realm that we operate in, is just the world of SOPs. But it doesn't limit, I don't believe that limits us in any way. So I just
I mean, I guess if it's true that 100% of everything is somehow placed within an SOP, then there's no limitation there.
Right. So I mean, I'm looking at the expert in SOPs. Would that, is that a fair statement?
For the most part, I would say yes. I mean, there might be a procedural thing that is written for a unit or something, but yeah, it's based on an SOP.
Yeah, if they don't have one, for example, the tire deflation devices, they didn't have an SOP for that. Even though they had them and they trained on them, they didn't have an SOP, so they decided they needed to write one. The same thing for vehicle blocking maneuvers. They don't have an SOP for those, even though it's something they utilize, and they realize that they have to write one for it. So I think that virtually everything would come under some sort of an SOP. Where there might not be is individual conduct, say the use of force training, where that intimated a need for a change of culture as opposed to an SOP, because the SOP is there. Now the use of force is going to change, but that presentation, those materials, there wouldn't be a standard SOP for those.
But there would be ways of inquiring as to what they are, I mean, and influencing what they train to. I mean, they do write, I guess you can't prescribe every word that comes out of the trainer's mouth, but you can, they create syllabus and lesson plans and things that they train to, and I think those are within, I mean, we have access to that sort of indirectly by getting at their training, getting into their training materials.
Yeah.
And I
Okay,
think
so
that,
this is like a non-issue. I was just providing examples.
right, well, but I think it's important to I mean, I want to address the idea that we're limited, and that I'm trying to put a limit on this. I mean, I think another aspect of this is that I'm not the committee, and I think it's the committee that decides what the direction of the.
I'm picking up what you're putting down, man.
Okay,
So you
all
don't
right.
think that we're limited.
I'm not.
That's
I don't,
great. I think we're all on the same page then.
Right.
And I think that we also already have worked on our internal process for how we're going to work on our own procedures. What Jim has suggested is that we kind of just get, and I agree that we kind of just get started, and at some point, we'll kind of like tweak our policies as they need to be tweaked until we feel like they're working really well. At which point we could consider maybe formalizing them into the board's rules and procedures, which seems to me like a good idea, because one thing that stands out to me is kind of like that we're even having to have all of these conversations. Like, if it's nice, I mean, it has pros and cons. On the one hand, it's nice you have a new group of people, the group of people can decide to do things how they want to do. But, if I think there already was a structure probably in place from the last configuration of this subcommittee, which we could have just adopted or continued to work within. That way we would have been, all this time that we've been talking about how to do the work, we could have just been already doing work, that would have been kind of nice. So I think this is nobody's fault, but I think some of that stuff existed, because when Jim pointed out, that in a previous subcommittee's minutes, there was already some of these discussions had been had. So I think we can debate on this topic of whether or not it's better for it to be open-ended, giving the subcommittee a lot of flexibility, or whether it's better not to have it formalized. That way you don't end up, different subcommittees don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. There's advantages and disadvantages to each, but what I suggest is that we work with what we have. We have both a policy for the OPA 352 stuff, and we also have, and Jim also, we don't have it here with us, but Jim also put together a policy based on what we discussed for how we'll move our own things out. And so I say we just kind of get started and fix things as they need to be fixed and have a conversation. Right now we don't have anything to work on with APD aside from 352, which we're all involved in that already. So I think we all stay in touch about that, and then I think we can kind of get busy on sharing our interests in other policy endeavors. What do you think about that?
well, there's a couple things, and I think I'd like to back up a second, and that is, I think that you touched on process, and I think that looking at our own policy and at the POB policies and procedures, which gets kind of confusing, but it's what governs the operation, what the rules that we've decided to adopt.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at, and I think this gets at how are we going to require, satisfy the requirement of the ordinance. I think what we should be doing, if you look at our policies and procedures, we're obligated to furnish a plan as to how we're going to meet this 50% plus criteria of work. No plan has been developed, and if I go into the policy and procedures, it's 20 pages long, and a large, it deals with the duties of the officers, and then it deals primarily with case review, and then one paragraph or one section within that deals with the policy process, and it deals very lightly with how that's done. And if you read it, it actually focuses on the CPOA as being the, and I think the language is confusing, but it says CPOA as looking at trend analysis, doing best practices research, and then making a report to the POB, and then we, take on policies for those changes. I don't think that's the way it should be, and but I think it can be construed that way, the way it's written. I think we need to write a better procedure for how we're going to actually make policy recommendations. I mean, I think that should be one of the functions of our committee is to do that, so that it doesn't fall off the rails every time you have a change in committee.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a practical aspect of this. It may say that 50% of the board members are, or 50% of the time the board members are supposed to be devoted toward policy. It can't be that 3 board members you do 3 times the work and that counts for everybody, or 4 board members do whatever.
Well, I'm open. I mean, if you have any concrete suggestions, then I'm sure we can easily adopt those. But I'm probably. And it's completely fine, but it doesn't upset me or bother me, but I'm probably not interested in having extensive, lots and lots and lots of meetings talking about how we're going to do work. I mean, we're not complying with the CASA if all we do is talk about, oh gee, how are we going to do the work? I think at some point the work needs to commence,
right.
And then perhaps we develop, while we're doing the work, we can develop a procedure as we see how things unfold, or perhaps we could spend a year doing policy work and then audit ourselves and figure out what the best practices that we discovered through actually doing the work. But I can't sit here meeting after meeting after meeting working on a procedure for how we deal with APD, a procedure for how we do our own things, a procedure for how we comply with the CASA. At some point, I want to move into the actual substantive work, because this is just going to drive me nuts.
Okay, all right. Well, then, what's your proposal?
I don't have a proposal. You're the one pointing out all these things.
Well, no, I mean, but if you want to move on now, let's assume that that's the case. What would your proposal be for substantive work? What task would you take on?
Well, like I've suggested, I think that we should have had on this agenda, or we could have on the next. I mean, we could still do it. It would be nice to have everyone here. I think we should have a session where we just discuss and brainstorm the types of policies we're interested in working on, and that's how we get started.
Okay.
And we need to figure out. I think we need an update from Ed on what's going on with this research contract. Because that's going to be a really important part, probably. I mean, I think everyone here is really interested in evidence-based and data-driven policies, and that's one really nice thing that we don't have to argue about that. But we're definitely have this really big obstacle of not having any access to any data or analysis of it.
What I'm trying to do is to get you to be more specific and not, and just
and I'm trying to get you to be less specific.
Okay, all right. Okay, so, all right. But
I mean, do you have a specific idea for how we create our own compliance plan? My specific idea, I've already proposed, is let's do this work for a year and then audit ourselves, and then use what we've learned to actually get some stuff in writing about best practices for compliance.
Well, and that would be what I think that would mirror what was happening in the previous administration at APD, and I think they're rightfully criticized for that. So I think if we recognize that we ought to be complying with the ordinance, then it's our obligation to think about how we're going to do that and write something down on paper how we're going to do that. And
do you have any ideas?
Yeah.
What are they?
Well, well, I've actually written things down and sent them out. But I mean, I think that the process, we should systematically go through the ordinance and what it is that we're supposed to be, what it is we're supposed to be doing. And so when it comes to, we need to have a process for how we're going to deal with APD policy, because that's in the ordinance. We need to have a policy for a procedure for how we're going to deal with that. We need another procedure for essentially, and they all overlap, but we need our own procedure for how we're going to make proposals. I've written the procedure and I used the priority one called, using lights and sirens here, whatever, code 3. And what I suggest is that that starts by creating, somebody gets an idea, they take that idea and go, shop it around, go talk to some people, talk to APD. And I did that, and actually the person I talked to at APD about the Code 3 running was Ray Fritz. And I got information from him about how APD would view a change like that. I took this to I raised the issue at a community meeting. I think we need to have a process for receiving community input. I had talked to community friends who had actually made this proposal. So I think those are steps that you do to create a proposal. You then do some research. This is where a policy, an analyst comes in, or a data analyst comes in, and that actually happened in this case too. So we did the subject matter experts, community input, policy analysts, and then you write a proposal and start that through APD's process, or you can either.
I think that sounds great, and
Right.
I think Jim also proposed something. So what I'm
Right.
proposing is that why don't we talk about policies we want to work on, pick one,
Okay.
and go through that process,
Right,
and then
okay.
kind of fine tune it.
Okay. So it's
And then once
the
it's
ball's in your court now to pick policy.
You want me to independently pick a policy?
Well, suggest something that we can talk about. I mean, this seems to me to be the elephant in the room is how, let's grab onto something. And if we don't like it,
I feel like I've just been asking for us to have that conversation. And
okay.
I don't know if you're avoiding it.
No, I'm not avoiding it. I'm insisting on it.
Okay, so we're not getting a lot of things done right now.
Right.
Okay. So there's a want from you to have a brainstorming session. I think we can do that. We've done that before with the POB in its entirety, right, Ed? Where we had our storming and norming and we're trying to figure out our mission statement. Is that something we can do at this meeting, or do we have to do a special
I think it's
meeting?
something that you could do offline, just between yourselves, to say, here are a list of policies that I'm interested in, and you can share it with the fellow subcommittee members, and then those can all go on the next agenda.
Okay. So can we get a list of policies, or what's on the table? Do we know what's on the table available for everyone to look at?
Yes, I've sent this out a number of times.
Okay.
Yeah. And
What?
Policies that have been looked at, and the status. If you're looking for something that hasn't ever been talked about before,
We should put everything on the table.
Right,
is the thing.
right.
Everything
Okay.
should be available to everyone, so we know we can prioritize, and then what we can pick.
And so what he's referring to are the things that the subcommittee has done previously, right?
And done is a pretty broad term. I mean, they've been in front of the subcommittee, they've been over at APD, they've started with APD, they started here. There were minor changes, major changes. I mean, there's all a gamut of things.
Okay.
And
Well, I think
they
that-
may have even been, sent to APD and rejected. I mean, there's.
So either way, we got to sit down and look at everything and check on the status. It seems like we need to check on the status of everything and see where it is in its life.
Yes, which I've asked that we do that also.
Okay.
And I sent you a document that
Uh-huh.
includes essentially everything you've said.
I mean, but I've asked that we do it in a meeting so that we
Okay,
can all
alright.
talk about. I mean, the document doesn't have it just doesn't have enough information or context for me to understand all the things I want to understand.
Okay, but then we should take that document and start talking about it.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
in a
exactly
meeting.
what I
All
said.
right,
Yes.
did you bring it?
Cool.
No,
Okay.
I have it on my-
So here we are. I mean,
I didn't bring it either, so.
don't
Right,
put this
right.
on me. I asked
Never
you
either.
repeatedly to put it on the agenda.
So
Yeah,
let's
well,
stay on
we're-
track. Let's stay on
okay.
track. So we have an agreement that we're gonna have a meeting, we're gonna bring the document to us, to everyone, we're gonna hash through it, get a current status of it, that's something I can do, I can put that in an Excel sheet, so we can all be on the same page of everything, okay. So next,
Would it be more productive for you to do it conceptually as opposed to by a policy? So I want to, as example, use of force, or I'm interested in child welfare, or I'm interested in traffic vehicle collisions, so that you're not necessarily tied to a policy, and then you can assign that behavior to whatever policy might be appropriate, and then start the examination that way, as opposed to trying to look at all the policies and say, oh, this is the policy I want to work on.
Yeah, no, I think that that's kind of what I'm suggesting when it comes to like brainstorming. I think a lot of the policies are going to be derived from behaviors that we want to change. So I think that there are so many possible things. Like, I mean, if you're, I feel like there might be a suggestion that I don't have any policy ideas, which is why I'm not naming any policy ideas. That's definitely not the case. I have like a whole notebook full of them. So I want, I don't want to like, you know, sit here and talk at you guys all night, but I do think, you know, we kind of do, we have a chat about what's on the table, what's been done before. We kind of have a chat about different things people are interested in, because I think there's all kinds of cool stuff we can work on.
cool. So let's plan on doing that at some future meeting, having that discussion. There was something else that you had brought up, I'm not sure, I forgot what we were talking about. Okay, so what else do we need to do in order to brainstorm and to figure our strategic way forward? We'll get the list, we'll get our passions together, what we want to do and what we want to address. We also should probably talk about what do they want us to focus on, correct? Is that right?
I think we do.
Or
I mean,
we define
I
that
think
for
we
the board.
define
Okay.
that for the board.
Cool.
I mean, it's certainly going to be interactive, but I think it has to start with us.
Okay.
If we hear something, if something
Yeah. Or
any
if anyone
board,
sends us an email saying like, I'm interested in this problem, or, you know, then we
Right,
can take a look
right.
at that.
Okay.
And I think it's also useful, I also suggested to Bill that maybe we send out an email soliciting something like that. That way we can also discuss those things when we have our brainstorming session. Not that we're gonna be short on ideas, but just so that, like, you know, the various board members are having an opportunity to be heard through this committee, because
Yes.
we can't all do all of them.
So we'll send an email out and we'll also mention it at our meeting as well, depending on when this time frame of when we sit down and do this. Maybe our next subcommittee meeting will be that breakout session.
so here's a short version of what
Uh-huh.
of what I've sent out, which is a list.
Uh-huh.
I mean, what I'm trying to do is to get. I mean, you want to be specific, or maybe who wants to be specific? You wanted me to be more specific, and I believe this is a specific list.
Well, yeah, but she's trying to say, what I believe she's trying to say is that she may have a specific passion towards something that may not actually fit in
Right.
here.
Okay.
Well, and I mean,
What-
here's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Let me say what I'm trying to say. Okay. January 16th, there was an action description, UNM ISR on body camera system research. Well, what is that? What happened with it? Did we make a recommendation? Is the problem, if we didn't, is the problem still ongoing? That kind of thing.
And
Just
through-
kind of simple,
And
you know?
through that discussion, we can start building our template on how we should, on the procedure of how we run ourselves. Does that make sense? So as she'll
Right,
start
right.
throwing the questions, I was like, okay, well, that's a good question. Maybe we should put it on our workbook, and, you know, we're tracking this. And it's like, well, where are we on this point in that? I think that's this next meeting where we have our sit down is kind of going to help you out in terms of the architecture of what you want to see. I think there's good on both ends.
Great job mediating.
I was just getting pissed off. I'm like, we're not getting anywhere. Let's get on forward.
I mean, so I'm fine with like, Bill wanting to come up with a procedure, and I'm sure Jim will be really interested in that too. And I agree also that we should have a procedure and compliance plan, but I don't think that what we should do is we should sit here being super bogged down and trying to anticipate work that we're not getting started on.
Exactly.
I mean, I think these are kind of parallel track types of things.
I
And
agree.
we've made a lot of progress because we've developed a subcommittee internal procedure for how we like kind of handle what comes in through APD. And then we've also we have two really good ideas, one from you and one from Bill on the table about how we get our own procedures out. And we kind of just need to work within these structures, fine tune them, and then slap it onto some paper and present it to the board.
But I don't think it
Yeah.
takes all of us to do that. What she's saying, it doesn't take all
Yeah.
of our
I
minds
guess-
to occupy that action.
And I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not opposed to doing what you want to do, and I agree that it needs to be done and is important also. But I guess where I do differ from you is that I don't think that we have to have that 100% figured out to perfection before we begin. Because we just don't make any progress when we insist on
That's
conducting
fair. Well,
ourselves
that's
that
fair.
way.
But I don't think you're describing what the situation is.
Okay. And what is the situation?
Well, I think the situation is that we are doing both of these things at the same time. And I think there has been a procedure that, is in
Well, we're not
the
working
work.
on any policies.
But that's, I guess, we can only work on your end if we really get in the dirt and do it. We need to get in there, figure it out, see, and kind of mold it as a living document, as a living resource for us, and build it as we go.
Right, no, I agree, and so what I was suggesting earlier is that give me an example of a policy that you would like to apply apply the process to, even the ill-defined process or the in-process process.
Okay. Well, I would feel more comfortable having the conversation with everyone here, but if you want examples of things that I'd like to work on.
I think that would be good. That would move. I think that would advance the conversation. That's what.
Okay.
Because I think
So-
that lets us talk.
Sure,
talk
sure,
about
sure.
the meat of something.
Let's see, figure out
So-
how I organize this. I think there is a lot of stuff we could do with OBRDs. Especially as it pertains to what happens in a use of force case and the arrival of internal affairs, etc. I think there are probably some policies we can look at regarding what happens after a use of force incident. Immediately after, like how the officers separate themselves, who is allowed to speak to who, those types of things. I think one of like the more bigger, and it would be kind of a more intellectual issue that would require definitely research. I mean, most of these would. I would like to tackle the issue and explore the matter of implicit bias. How do we screen for that? How do we correct that? If there is I know that some ways to screen for it do exist. I'm interested in talking about whether or not we can incorporate this into the academy. I'm interested in training surrounding populations that are vulnerable to targeting. And I'm interested in the data surrounding that, and I think that there could be a lot of opportunities to improve APD policy and community outcomes by looking at that. There is some really great research on how officers can and should interact with juveniles, and it's evidence-based. It's been tested. I actually know, I've met the woman, well, I guess I haven't met her. I've exchanged a lot of emails and information with her. But she has this training protocol that's evidence-based, kind of ready to go. And that would probably be pretty easy for us if, that's something where a lot of the work is done. We would just want to get APD to implement it, and then we would want APD to collect data on it so that we could, in the future, at a future time, we could go and, do an analysis of the raw data since the implementation and, have our own success story, and something to report. I'm interested in, let's see, the best way to educate officers on community resources and kind of disabusing them of the notion that jails are for mental health treatment, that the juvenile justice system is for family service, that the juvenile justice system is family services. People don't get good outcomes in those scenarios, and it's problematic that officers, and probably with good intentions a lot of the times, but it is problematic that officers are perpetuating these myths within their own cultures when we know the evidence is clear, it's back, the science is in, we know that those things are patently false. And so I think we should explore a way to kind of like deprogram some of those bugs within the academy. Let's see, what else? I'm interested in exploring, well, first I would need to check and see if we do this. I'm not 100% sure that APD is doing these anymore. There was some controversy around this at a certain point. But if this is still happening, and I don't know what would need to happen, we might need to do data, we might need to do some IPRA stuff, but I'm interested in banning quality of life patrols. Those are, patrols where officers will go and they will kind of like, I hate to say pick on, but they'll like public intoxication or public urination or even just like loitering at bus stops, which is really common. These tend to really over-criminalize vulnerable persons, and they also a lot of times are done in unconstitutional ways. I have some ideas of attorneys who might be like have some good information on something like that. This one I think is really out there, this idea, but I'm interested in this idea of expanding, okay, where do I start with this idea? So in light of Graham, we don't get a lot of, persons who are victims of crimes committed by officers, especially like, forms of violence, use of force. They really don't get very much justice in the criminal justice system. And I'm, that's problematic, but I don't think we can, like, we're not a litigation team, so we can't work on, like, challenging Graham. But I think there is a lot of really interesting information and data on restorative justice models. And I don't think that I've never seen them studied as applied to officers. But they're just really, really, really cool. They're cool things to look at. What you see when you look at restorative justice programs is you see really high rates of victim satisfaction, you see really low rates of recidivism, and so you do change the behavior, you do restore relationships. I think if we could explore doing like a pilot program like that, that could be really interesting. We might see that might help APD rebuild trust within the community, but I do feel like this idea is a little bit kind of eccentric maybe, and maybe like a little bit more than we might be prepared to take on, but I still think it's something we can talk about. Do you want more ideas?
Well, no, I think that's a good start. And,
okay. I have
that's
a few more
pages. I think you furnished enough examples to get to at least put this, in a perspective that I have a better perspective now on it. And I just in relation to your last comment there, restorative justice may not be so far out there. There was a speaker at a recent the Northeast Heights CPC meeting, Tom Elena, who talks about restorative justice, and he's got some pilot. He's been involved with pilot program, I think in Colorado somewhere, but they actually had a successful sort of, he's got a success story, whether it's continued success or not, I don't know. But anyway, no, the ideas are out there. And I, in the spirit of brainstorming, I don't wanna say no or, say anything negative about anything like this. But I think that's the, we need to do some more brainstorming around these kinds of ideas so that we can
Yeah.
sort of move them in
And I
a
think we
direction.
should have
now.
just a meeting dedicated to that, and I think the meeting should include any of the ideas we solicit from the board, the general board, and all of the members of the subcommittee, because, everyone I think has ideas they want to share. And then also it should include kind of just like chatting through each of these items to see if, if there are some that didn't get anywhere, which I would imagine probably because the administration, everyone was dealing with, et cetera. Probably a lot of these have just been tabled, and maybe we'll find that they're really, really, really interesting, and we want to kind of pursue one of these ideas that's already out there. And so I think we should have a meeting that's just dedicated to ideas and brainstorming, and I would suggest that.
No, I would suggest our last meeting place where we did that for the POB was in the Valley with the Starbucks location, where we can get that.
That was a facilitated discussion.
You're still talking about on the subcommittee level,
Yes.
right? I mean, so we can, well, if we thought a facilitator would be useful, I think we could do that too. I mean, the question is that what you're thinking of, or are you thinking of just the four of us plus?
I think all
I
of
mean,
us
the
with
core
an
committee
open
members.
mind and an understanding of where everyone's coming from. I don't think we would need a facilitator. We just need
Right.
facilities.
Okay, all right, okay,
Yeah.
okay. No,
Well, I mean, if you want us to find a more comfortable place or something for us, for you.
A big whiteboards, Post-its, markers, pens.
Mhm. I mean, we can obviously
Yeah.
we can facilitate all that, and we can find a different meeting room for you.
Okay. Are we good?
Yeah.
Our direction forward.
I mean, I think I feel like the only question that is outstanding is whether or not Bill is comfortable with having some questions left unanswered surrounding.
I live in a world of uncertainty, and I'm used to that. I like uncertainty. I recognize that there's
Okay.
limits to knowledge and what you can go with, and I believe in moving forward with what you have. And I agree. You have to pick up the places along the way.
To some degree.
To
yeah.
some degree,
Yeah.
but I mean, you have to find that line between having a plan and working in some kind of vacuum or chaos. But
Yeah.
and so I mean,
So
I
it would
think
be
what
really
this
cool
does.
if, we all picked one that
Right.
we really wanted to work on, and then as we did it, we fine-tuned the process that you're talking about, which is the shopping or brainstorming, the public comment. We kind of do it through the lens of an actual piece of policy work,
I
as
would
opposed
actually pitch myself as I would work directly at the policy, listen to you all, and then make those changes as you all go along. I love policy. I love writing crap together. I love doing all of that. So
Oh, good.
putting that architecture together for you all while you all see the errors or this could have been done there, let's move this way, that should be reflected in a document which you want. So the future policy procedure review boards can use that document as a guiding way to navigate through this.
Yeah, and if we find that it's really successful,
Okay, but let me understand better what you're saying. You want to create a document that is the process with a particular policy as an example, or you want to do this as a more
Dedicated
general.
me that I would be here to help facilitate that on my end.
Okay, and what is that? I guess is what I'm trying to understand.
I don't know. We have to sit down and figure it out.
But I mean, is it a general? Does it deal specifically with the policy and how we move that forward, or does it deal with
it would be
the
our
general
I think it would
process?
be our policy on policies.
Okay,
is
all
what
right,
we
but
would
that's
would
and
result
call
from
that, for lack of a better term, call that our process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I think that's
So
what we said.
our process on how to do a policy recommendation as opposed to our process demonstrated in a policy recommendation.
Correct.
Okay, all right, and that's,
Yes.
so I'm just.
So that
trying to
we're not
understand.
losing track of it, we're all giving it some attention, but we're not totally flooded with just doing, thinking about how we're gonna execute. We're actually
Yes.
doing the work, but we're getting it done at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I think that a conversation that could be left for the future is, whether or not we want to formalize what we've done. We could leave it just for us because we find it's really helps us be successful, and we could just decide that's how we're going to do it. Or we could decide whether or not we want to kind of formalize it. That way future subcommittees don't reinvent the wheel again, and they have something to work with, and they don't have to have these conversations over,
Yes.
And so we could figure out, like, if we like it enough, if we want to formalize it.
I think that, but I hear you saying that you're wanting to formalize it. You're the formalizer here.
I'm the collaborator.
Okay, but.
I'm putting it all in one place. So
Okay,
Well,
that
what
we're
I
not
mean-
losing track of it.
that's a formalizing in my
Well, what I
idea in
mean
my
by-
mind. I mean, it's.
What I
yeah.
mean by formalize
Okay,
is
all right.
whether or not the POB wants to adopt these procedures so that they're official procedures that cannot be deviated from. So that the future subcommittee would have to say, like, here's our structure, here's kind of how we do it. And whether or not we want to do that, there's a lot to discuss there, but I'm just saying that that's a conversation that we can have in the future. If we
Well-
find it super successful in helping us comply, et cetera, then we can talk about formalizing it in that manner.
Yes.
Okay, but where I take exception, I guess, is that I see this more, whatever we write as a procedure is never going to be something that cannot be deviated from, but it's a
It
guideline.
depends on what we vote on, or what we
Right.
agree to.
Right,
Right,
but
well,
I mean,
the board
even,
could always,
even
I
when
mean, if
you,
it just
when
wasn't
it's a matter of
working.
wording something so that you
Uh-huh.
you create a guideline that complies with what you're trying to do, rather than prescribes what
Yes,
you're trying to
exactly.
do. So
Okay,
that's,
but
that's what I'm
like I
saying.
said, I'm just like, that's a future conversation, but I'm just.
But I think we ought to
that's
have
something
that-
we get out of this.
Right, okay, but I think, I'm just trying to be clear on the goal, and so.
The goal is to work in parallel, both in the policy and the procedure.
Yeah, the goal is
arena.
to figure out our process
Yes.
and to formalize it for
We're
ourselves.
still very young, we still gotta figure out how we operate as a subcommittee.
Right,
Yep.
okay, as long as, right, okay, I'm in agreement, right,
Cool.
right.
Okay,
Yes, right.
cool.
Did you get all that down, Marie?
More or less.
All right.
Is there anything else?
Well, since, I don't know that I'd like to hear from, I think it'd be good to have a recap of what's going on with 352 and that. And we've had, there's been a number of, APD isn't
Sure,
here,
sure,
obviously,
yeah.
but I think that was one of the other items on the agenda, so if we could get, maybe the director could summarize that.
Well, 352, as far as we had the meeting with the stakeholders the first 2 days when the monitor was in town. That was the 12th and the 13th. And based upon those meetings, I think it became clear that 352 was going to be redrafted because there were a lot of inconsistencies pointed out, especially by Dean Matheson from the law school. So the basic structure for the flow chart is going to still be in place, and as the POB is concerned, there should be a 2 to 3 month notice before a policy is written with its changes and presented to the POB for consideration. But that is incumbent on POB, the representative from the POB, and myself at the Office of Policy Analysis, informing the board that this is the policy that was at OPA. So you need to start to consider that this policy is coming. So do your work, because it's going to be coming in the next 60 to 90 days. And if that timeline holds, then the board's 30-day consideration timeline that's built into that flow should work. If not, then there has to be consideration to expand that beyond 30 days so the board has enough time to consider it and share its thoughts with the chief. So the last is that there were lots of suggestions that were being taken into consideration, and there's going to be a rewriting of 352, but it is the first policy that they have to get done before they want anything else. So we're waiting on that new rewrite at this point. Accurate?
Well, I think that is the bottom line, is that 352 is APD's policy on policies, and we tend to react to what they do in that regard when they write a policy. And we can't do anything to it until they propose it. Mm-hmm. And then it's a matter of how much time we have to get the work done.
I mean, I think the only thing that we were concerned about, well, actually, I think there were two things. The only thing I remember was that question of how many days we get. And I think that we should just try to secure the amount of time we need before they roll out an official draft. That way we're not fighting with them after they're done. You know what I mean? So I think we should follow up with Jeremy and just say, did you get an answer on that? Where are you guys on that? That way, hopefully it's worked in. And then there was one other thing I felt like, I don't know.
But let's deal with that first, because I'm sure, I don't see that. Well, tell me what you think about that. I mean, what we're talking about is 30 to 45 days or some number like
right.
that as well.
I think that the board is going to have to pay attention, and it's going to there's going to be it's going to be incumbent on whoever sits on OPA to bring that information back to this committee and to the full board, so that you know what policy is coming up in 60 to 90 days, and you have that time to prepare. And with that time, 30 days should be enough, because you should be able to receive it and then be able to respond within the 30 days, the next board meeting.
Because the work's already
Because the work should have commenced
on the front end.
on the front end, correct.
Yeah.
And right now, what they're talking about for previewing a policy is 2 weeks before an open meeting. Now, are you
Right.
is that the timeline you're talking about?
So the way that they have it set up now, there'll be a package. This is their theory. They'll have a package together to support the changes that are being considered for the policy. So that's going to come out even 2 weeks before OPA. So that information can be distributed to the board right away. So then it will go to OPA, and then it will go through the process to go for comments to the public, to the officers, then to PPRB. Once it goes from PPRB, it will then be presented to the board. So there will be essentially 2.5, 3 months. And you will have the documentation that the department is using in order to justify those changes. So there should be enough information on the front end for the board to be able to react within a 1 meeting turnaround.
Because during
That's a good
all that
point.
time, this subcommittee is dealing with all of that, and then just makes their final deal when it's
Right.
Yeah.
final.
I mean, I guess the only thing it doesn't allow time for is, so the way I'm like expecting it to work with the board is that, the full board is really not going to do much with that information. They're going to really rely on the trust they've delegated over to us to do it for them. And I think that's fine. I think it makes sense that things work that way. And so the problem that I think is at least like conceivable, although I don't know how I don't know how useful it is to worry about this hypothetical problem, I guess. But I guess what I was thinking is like, well, what if we, you know, have some like guidance for the entire board and we take it to them and the board has like, you know, we can't really agree on how to move forward, then in that situation we would really need like another, you know, term to hash it out. But maybe that's not a very like realistic concern, because I'm sure the board will probably trust, you know.
Well,
our
and
conclusion.
what we're talking about are majority decisions. That's the way it's advanced from the board.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not a unanimous decision.
Right, and the board could, if in fact that happened, the board could request
Some like an
extension of time before it's submitted to the monitor, because this is the step between it going to the monitor for final consideration, and the monitor has expressed their desire that the board have its input and have its say. So there's strong indication that if the board
needed.
wanted more time, they could get it.
Okay, I'm feeling like you guys are right. I'm feeling comfortable with the time frame now, more so than I was before. I'm a reasonable man. I can listen.
Okay, well, you're going to have to provide more evidence.
I'm not sure. I don't recall what the other concern
I don't
was. Oh well, my concern, and maybe it's the one I don't. My concern is that they're front loading this with all of this public comment and all of this input, and making it appear as though the community is going to be writing the policy, where I think that APD has the right to write its own policy, and then the public can certainly comment on it and have input. But I believe that the department that's still the department's domain to write the policy. And I think that as they're proposing it with public meetings and all this other stuff, I think it's just going to be a jumbled mess. But that's how they want to proceed. Dean Matheson disagrees with me. Thinks it should be that way. I believe that it's the department's domain to write its policy. It certainly should get public input, but ultimately they have to write it. They're responsible for it. They have to train it. They have to live it. They have to work it. So, but that was my only other, concern, besides the fact that there were lots of contradictions with it, and hopefully they're going to write those out.
Well, and I think that the issue that raises for me is that I think we should talk about, and maybe it's a brainstorming session of its own, about how we fit into this public comment. Because I think, first of all, it's difficult to get substantive public comment for something like this. The people who pay attention to it, there aren't very many people who are going to pay attention to it to begin with. The kind of public comment that's going to be substantive is going to come from Dean Matheson, or people like that who are already amici or some connected to the process, I think. And so, if we want to truly get public, community input, I think that's where we have to be the conduit for that input to the process. And incorporate that kind of community, go listen for the community, that's what outreach actually is defined as in our procedures and in the ordinance, is that we receive community input. Our outreach is not to tell them what we're doing, but to find out what they want. That's what it says we're supposed to be doing. So that says we're in a position then to, be the ones who sort of empower the community or strengthen the recommendations that may come from the community. So the community is not going to be capable of making a substantive recommendation without the help of the POB. This is a proposal now. So the question is, what should our relationship be there? Because that requires an effort on our part. But I think that's the policy recommendation effort that we're tasked with in the ordinance. That's I'm giving an interpretation of what I think the ordinance says.
Okay.
So we should be getting community input. We should be strengthening their process. And I think we need to carve out distinction between the kind of things that the CPCs get and are recommending and what we make. And right now, I think the distinction is primarily many of their recommendations fall into the category of suggestions. They haven't done anything other than say, here, this would be a good idea. They don't furnish any supporting evidence. I think to make it into a true substantive recommendation, we should be take those, go listen to the recommendations that they're proposing, accept the good ones, and then strengthen them and bring them forward. I mean, that would be one process.
Are you on the outreach committee? It seems like that would be
Not
a good place
anymore.
for that
I
conversation.
don't think. Yeah, I think it is, and I think outreach should be almost the policy receiving arm of the POB. I mean, that ought to be the functional outreach, I think. But I don't think it's very separable from making recommendations. I think they're just two things associated with how you get a recommendation made.
Well, one thing I would say is just don't forget that you are the community as well. So it's not like you're separate from them. I mean, encourage whatever community to come to you during the meetings, during public comment, make the recommendations here, there at the POB. But you are the community voice as well. So you don't get substantive comment from Joe Blow on the street. You're the community. So, I mean, I always hear this distinction, and it's like you are the community.
But one reason I make that distinction is because if you go to our meetings, how are we connected to the community? We have to have some connection.
Well, that's where the outreach is, to tell people, come to our meeting, we are your voice, to convey these. You have concerns, we have that voice, we have the ear.
Right.
So come to us.
Right.
And that's where the outreach comes in,
that's just not happening very well.
Well, and so that's another issue. But I mean, I wouldn't be so wrapped up in we're not getting community input. You are the community. You were picked by council and all that. So
right.
I mean, don't dwell on it. I wouldn't think you dwell on it so much. Just.
Well, I guess this is about due
Bill
diligence.
likes dwelling on stuff. That's kind of his thing.
Well, I think it's well, okay, all right. All right. Well, let's move on. All right, yeah. I agree. Let's move on. Okay.
Time for my report.
Yes.
Okay. We interviewed the 3 finalists for the senior admin position today, so tomorrow we'll be checking references and hopefully making a decision next week. We have our service window in and our rolling we are in our rolling screen, so our part of our security upgrade is completed. The biggest thing is that I was contacted by APD recruiting today, and they would like the policy and procedure subcommittee to consider 2 actions, one of them long-term, one of them short-term. The short-term is they would like a policy recommendation on an exit interview for officers that are leaving and have left the department, so that they have real data on why they're leaving as opposed to the speculation that it's only the pay. And the longer term recommendation is creating opportunities for career growth within the department, like creating a separate promotion path for detective, so that the department isn't so linear, and that the longevity pay isn't about being on the department a long time. It's about advancing your career. So those were 2 aspects that recruiting asked this subcommittee to consider, and I leave it there.
I would like to ask you to thank them for reaching out to us.
So
Those are good ideas.
who should we get in contact with
Regarding,
these 2?
well, the recruiting officer is Russ Alberti.
Is he the one who did the recruiting segment of
He
the?
did.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, he was nice.
But the discussion came about because the presentation to the public is, that, they netted, what, 3 over the last year?
Right.
Because
Plus or minus 1, but.
right, they netted 3 officers with graduating over 100, and the presentation is that it's all about pay, why the officers are leaving, but they have no data to back that up. They don't do an exit interview. They don't contact the officers to say, why are you leaving? Why are you going to this other department? They just are assuming that it's because there's a larger paycheck there. So this is something that the committee could decide and make a recommendation
Yeah, that would be an easy one
next
to
month.
do. Yeah.
Do exit interviews, set a timeline.
Although
for,
I'm curious as to why can't they just decide to just do that? Like, why do they need us to make a recommendation?
because
They
they
feel like
they
they
don't
don't have
want
the
to
ear of
wait
the-
for the bureaucracy of HR, the city,
Yeah.
and this is a much more direct way to get it
Something in front of the chief.
in a decision maker, to a decision maker.
Okay.
What would their process normally be?
They would have to go through HR.
Why,
develop
and why,
through-
why would they?
Well,
They're
How-
using
I mean-
us. They're using us as a conduit to bridge a gap they have with HR right now. I think that's both noble and a good workaround.
Do you understand how that works?
No, but there's a lot of, I guess, legalese and a lot of differing opinions and less, I guess, risk assumption in going through HR versus with us, it's more direct.
I think what's safe to assume is that this is just probably a lot faster for them. And it's probably really fast for us, that one. I don't know about the second one.
no, the second one would have to entail some research,
Right,
and there would have to be some looking at, the budget and the numbers and what proposals are for longevity pay versus, how could those monies be spent more efficiently with providing career growth, as opposed to simply saying, all right, at 7 years you get this, at 15 years you get this.
Mm-hmm.
And is that going to be, does that provide more job satisfaction? Because they will tell you all the time that officers don't do the job because of the pay, yet on the other hand they say, well, they leave because of the pay. So there has to be, there clearly are more reasons. And it could also, these exit interviews could help define other issues within the department that
Mm-hmm.
need addressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we can, on the next agenda, we can take a vote on that first one. We can discuss it and decide if we want to do that. My feeling is that I will support having us take action on that first item.
Okay, but why do we need to vote? See, this is,
Well-
why can't one of us jump into this process?
Well, it's
Using-
it's a recommendation that would come from the board
Okay, but.
to the chief.
But, I
and
mean, to
within-
make the recommendation.
within the ordinance.
Okay, but, so one of us somebody has to put together a proposal that we're gonna make, the recommendation that we're gonna present to the board. What I'm suggesting is, let's assume that one of us wants to do that. That's all it takes to make a policy recommendation. Anybody can make a policy recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
I think the board is just a way to facilitate, the committee
I
is
view
just a way
us as
to.
just generally working together. I think
Oh.
that's a better practice. And,
Okay, all right, then that's okay, but it also would help if we had a skeleton, a draft or something, proposal. And so how do we get that, how do we make the first step?
So you're saying that we don't need a vote in order to start discussion or working on it versus when we have a finished product, we need to vote on it?
Right, that's what
yeah,
I'm
I'm not disputing that.
Okay.
Right, okay, but I'm trying to get
I'm just saying, like, on the agenda, we'll have Jim here, and we'll be able to say, hey, do we all think, do we have a joint agreement that we want to do this one? And if so, let's bang it out. Who volunteers to create a draft?
Okay,
But how soon do you think
Right.
you can get that out to the rest of the subcommittee? That kind of stuff.
right, okay.
However that's gonna look like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, but what I'm saying is let's get a perspective on what the time scale is we're talking about here, so.
We'll do that the next meeting.
Yeah, but when it's on the.
Okay, so
yeah.
so it's not urgent, we don't need to do it, you know, we're not talking about getting something out in a month, because we're not gonna meet for another month, so, and we're gonna start in a month. I just wanna lay it all out on the table as to what the time scale is. How would you expect that would play out? I mean, if the reason they're coming to us is that they wanna save time, you know.
Even if we take 2 or 3 months, I'm gonna guess, you know, just my having experienced very much bureaucracy in different areas of my life, even though I don't work at APD, that it's going to be faster, then they'll be able to do it. And if they get it done first, then fantastic.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I'm also trying to get a sense of what you're.
You're trying to egg me on.
No, I'm
Seems like it.
I'm trying to egg you on. I want to get a sense of what banging it out means to you.
It seems to me like it's I think it seems to me like it's even I think you're complicating it too much.
Okay.
You could contact everybody in the POB. You could say, anybody have any examples of exit surveys from employment? You can put together a draft. Next month you could have it on the agenda and you could say, Chief, you need to institute exit surveys, and you can do it by special memo, however you want to do it, but we need to have it instituted within 60 days. And here's an example.
Yeah,
And put
that would
it
be
in.
fine too.
And then he has 45 days to say yay or nay.
Cool. I do think we need a facilitator though for our meeting.
For the brainstorming
Yes,
meeting?
we will.
Okay. All right. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Is that going to be next month?
Well, what other business do we have? Are you done with your
Oh,
report?
I'm done with my report, yes.
I have no other business. I think we can, we've reviewed 6. Any other business?
No.
Adjourn?
No, we have the next meeting date.
Oh.
So we have 2 meetings. We'd have a regular monthly meeting, and then also, is that going to be in conjunction with or separate from the brainstorming session? That's something we have to determine. When's our next meeting scheduled? Do we have that?
I'm a
I
more
think this
informed
is
person in
this is the regular date.
instance,
If this works for you, this is a good date.
So the one after
this
the
was
POB meeting.
the Thursday after the POB meeting, but maybe this is
19th.
this
Next
is-
scheduled
this
meeting
happens
for
to
us
be
is on the 19th of April. Same time, same place.
for our committee.
Yes.
Okay,
If we're
19th.
going by after the POB meeting, it's
Okay.
19th.
Okay.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. The next meeting is April 19th.
Okay, so are we having our brainstorming at that time? It's already kind of late in the evening for a lot of people I figure the brainstorm is going to take longer than this meeting. And we should allow that to bleed over so we have a lot of good discussion and a lot of good movement. So last POB meeting we had it on a weekend in the morning, I think late morning. Is that something that we could entertain the possibility of?
I can do that.
Except
Yeah.
not the week of the 8th because I have the Book of Mormon on Saturday.
I'm very flexible. I kind of feel bad for like Ed and Diane, you know, because this is their job, so it kind of sucks to like drag them out on the weekend. But you also have like, you know, your like very understandable limitations because of your job and etc. So I'll just leave it up to you guys. Whenever you want to do it is fine with me. Except I am very anti being places before 9 a.m. if I can avoid it.
That's everyone.
Very anti.
I'm switching jobs, so I can't be as flexible as I could.
Okay.
So, we can do it during the which weekend? Anyone thinking anything? So the POB meeting, what makes sense? If we do our brainstorming the week and before the POB meeting, that's the week of the 7th, or the Saturday the 7th, then we could have what our future goals are, short-term, long-term. We can take that to the POB and present that to them. And then we could execute on the 19th. Will that work for everyone? Given that CPOA can find us a location and a facilitator by then.
On the 7th?
7th.
I think that works for me.
Sure.
Okay, anytime after 10.
Okay.
So CPOA will get that for us.
Cool.
Okay.
So that's
And that's
just a
something
couple
we can,
of
like,
short,
pretty
couple of
easily
short weeks
afford?
away. I'm sorry?
I was just, is that something we can pretty easily afford? Do you think we should ask ourselves that question? I mean, if we have plenty of money, then we don't need to, but.
Well, we hopefully, I think
We have everything, and I think we could find a volunteer facilitator.
Okay.
You're a trained facilitator.
Is-
No, I.
Doesn't want to get himself.
I know.
Not groups in that way?
I withdraw the question.
Yeah, not groups in that way. I mean, taking groups in, I'm more of a mediator, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
one-on-one kind of thing. So 10 o'clock on the 7th?
Yes, and location TBD.
TBD, okay.
Facilitator TBD. But pens, markers, Post-its, fun stuff like that.
Okay.
Very good. And do we need to have an agenda for that? Or is it just the agenda that we're going to have a breakout?
Just a brainstorm
Yeah.
session.
Okay.
You're not making any business decisions per se.
But it's an open meeting. Is that, I
It
mean,
doesn't have to be.
No.
Yeah. None of these have to be. We're just allowing them to be.
okay, all right.
Yeah. Which I'm not trying to change that.
No,
Maybe, but we
no,
gotta
I'm-
keep this next thing simple, you know? We just get together on that day.
Okay. Well, I guess the other aspect of it is, do we record it? Is it necessarily recorded, or is that?
We didn't record the last one.
Okay.
We just,
So-
we
Let's-
saved did we save our notes, or we just took
Say
notes?
yeah, we did
We just, yeah, because we came up with our purpose and.
I'm just trying to find the line between being public and overburdening our resources. So,
Which is goal setting.
This is internal for you guys to just hammer
okay,
it
all
out.
right.
Cool.
Great meeting,
Yeah.
everyone. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Move to adjourn.
We got rid of those rules. We're done.
Wait, no, we have to adjourn them. Somebody has to say it. Okay, meeting is adjourned. Okay.